They thought it was just another faded school portrait from the past, until the restoration revealed the truth. At the edge of the frame, one boy wasn't holding books. He was clutching bones. Dr. Marcus Henley had always found solace in the dusty archives of Millbrook's Historical Society. But the photograph that landed on his desk that October morning would shatter his peaceful world forever. As the town's lead archivist, Marcus had seen thousands of old photographs. But this 1887 class portrait from the defunct Whitmore Academy immediately caught his attention. The sepia-toned image showed 23 children arranged in 3 neat rows, their Victorian clothing pristine, and their expressions appropriately solemn for the era's lengthy exposure times. What disturbed Marcus wasn't the typical formality of 19th-century photography. It was the boy standing at the far right edge of the back row. While his classmates held the usual props of slate boards and textbooks, this pale, thin boy clutched what appeared to be a collection of small, yellowed objects in his cupped hands. Marcus adjusted his magnifying glass and leaned closer to his desk lamp, his breath catching as the details became clearer. The objects were unmistakably bones, small ones, possibly from birds or rodents. And the boy's expression held an unsettling intensity that seemed to pierce through the decades. His dark eyes stared directly into the camera with an awareness that felt almost supernatural, as if he knew someone would eventually scrutinize this moment across the span of time. The photograph had been donated anonymously, left in the Society's overnight drop box, with only a yellowed envelope bearing the words, "The Whitmore Collection. Handle with care." Marcus immediately began cross-referencing the image with the Historical Society's records, but Whitmore Academy appeared nowhere in Millbrook's educational archives. This was particularly strange, as Marcus prided himself on knowing every school, church, and significant building that had ever existed in their small Connecticut town. The building in the photograph's background showed Gothic Revival architecture typical of the 1880s, with distinctive arched windows and ornate stonework that Marcus didn't recognize from any local structure. As the day progressed, Marcus found himself repeatedly drawn back to the photograph, each examination revealing new troubling details. The boy with the bones wore clothing that was noticeably shabbier than his classmates, and there was something about his posture, slightly separate from the group, as if he didn't quite belong, that suggested he was an outsider even among children. Most disturbing of all, Marcus began to notice that several of the other children in the photograph appeared to be looking at the bone-collecting boy with expressions of fear or revulsion, their young faces capturing a moment of genuine terror that the formal photography of the era rarely preserved. That evening, Marcus took the photograph home to his small apartment above the antique bookstore on Main Street, unable to shake the feeling that he was looking at evidence of something far more sinister than a childhood prank. He spent hours researching Whitmore Academy online, combing through genealogical databases and historical records, but found absolutely nothing. It was as if the school had been completely erased from history, leaving only this single haunting photograph as proof of its existence. The more Marcus studied the image, the more convinced he became that the bones in the boy's hands weren't random playground finds. They were too carefully arranged, too deliberately displayed, as if they held some specific significance that he couldn't yet understand. As midnight approached, and Marcus finally prepared for bed, he placed the photograph on his nightstand, planning to resume his research in the morning. But as he turned off the lamp and darkness filled the room, he could swear he felt the boy's intense gaze boring into him from across the centuries. And he whispered to the shadows, "What were you trying to tell us?" "Marcus," arrived at the Historical Society the next morning with dark circles under his eyes and a notebook filled with theories about the mysterious photograph. His restless night had been punctuated by vivid dreams of Victorian children and scattered bones, leaving him more determined than ever to uncover the truth behind the Whitmore Academy image. His first call was to Eleanor Blackwood, the elderly town historian who had lived in Millbrook for over 80 years and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of local lore that often surpassed official records. When Marcus described the photograph over the phone, Eleanor's normally cheerful voice took on a grave tone that sent chills down his spine. "Marcus, dear," Eleanor said slowly, "I think you need to come to my house immediately and bring that photograph with you. There are things about our town's history that aren't written in any official records, things that were deliberately forgotten." Within an hour, Marcus found himself sitting in Eleanor's cluttered Victorian parlor. The photograph spread across her antique coffee table as she studied it through a jeweler's loupe. Her wrinkled hands trembled slightly as she examined the image, and Marcus watched her face grow increasingly pale with each passing moment. Eleanor finally set down the magnifying device and looked at Marcus with eyes that held decades of carefully guarded secrets. "The boy's name was Timothy Ashford," Eleanor began, her voice barely above a whisper. "And that photograph should never have survived what happened in 1887. She explained that Whitmore Academy had indeed existed, but only for a single school year before a tragedy forced its permanent closure and subsequent removal from all official records. According to Eleanor's grandmother, who had been a contemporary of the children in the photograph, Timothy Ashford was an orphan from the local poorhouse who had been given a scholarship to attend the prestigious private school. However, his obsession with collecting bones and his claims of being able to speak with the dead quickly made him an outcast among his wealthy classmates and a source of growing concern for the school's administration. The situation escalated dramatically in the spring of 1887. Eleanor continued, when several students reported that Timothy had been bringing human bones to class, small finger bones and teeth that he claimed were gifts from the old teacher who never left. The school's headmaster, Cornelius Whitmore, initially dismissed these reports as childhood fantasies, but his attitude changed when the gardener made a horrifying discovery while preparing the school's flower beds for planting. Buried in shallow graves throughout the academy's grounds were the remains of at least 7 children, all approximately Timothy's age, with evidence suggesting they had died under mysterious circumstances over the past several decades. Marcus felt his blood run cold as Eleanor described how the investigation that followed revealed that Timothy Ashford possessed an uncanny ability to locate burial sites, leading authorities to believe he had been guided by supernatural forces to uncover evidence of a decades-old pattern of child disappearances. The previous headmaster, Edmund Crowe, had apparently been using the isolated academy as a hunting ground for vulnerable children, particularly orphans whose disappearances would go unnoticed by society. When authorities attempted to arrest Crowe, they discovered he had died 3 months earlier, under suspicious circumstances, but not before Timothy had somehow learned about the hidden graves and began his macabre collection as a way of giving voice to the forgotten victims. The scandal that erupted was so devastating that Millbrook's most prominent families, many of whom had sent their children to Whitmore Academy, used their considerable influence to suppress all records of the school's existence and the crimes that had occurred there. The surviving students were sworn to secrecy, the academy building was demolished within weeks, and Timothy Ashford himself disappeared from town, never to be seen again. Eleanor reached across the table and grasped Marcus's hand with surprising strength. her eyes reflecting a lifetime of carrying this terrible knowledge, and she said with quiet intensity, "The question isn't what Timothy was trying to tell us. It's why that photograph has resurfaced now, after all these years of silence." Determined to verify Eleanor's shocking revelations, Marcus spent the following days conducting the most intensive research of his career, using every resource at his disposal to uncover concrete evidence of the Whitmore Academy tragedy. His investigation led him to the basement archives of the county courthouse, where he discovered that several property records from the 1880s had been deliberately obscured or misfiled, suggesting a systematic effort to erase evidence of the school's existence. After hours of painstaking work, Marcus found a surveyor's map from 1886 that clearly showed the academy's location, a plot of land that was now occupied by Millbrook's most exclusive residential development, Crescent Hill Estates. Armed with this information, Marcus approached the current property owners under the pretense of conducting a routine historical survey for the town's upcoming bicentennial celebration. What he discovered at 3 different houses in the development sent shockwaves through his understanding of the case. Each homeowner reported similar unexplained phenomena: children's voices heard in empty rooms, small bones appearing mysteriously in their gardens, despite no apparent source, and the persistent feeling that something tragic had occurred on their property. Most disturbing of all, Marcus learned that 2 families had found human remains while doing landscaping work, discoveries that had been quietly handled by local authorities, without any public disclosure or proper archaeological investigation. The breakthrough in Marcus's investigation came when he located the personal diary of Margaret Whitmore, the headmaster's daughter, in a private estate sale in the neighboring town of Ashford Mills. The diary, which had been sold as part of an antique lot, contained detailed entries from the spring of 1887 that corroborated Eleanor's account with chilling specificity. Margaret wrote extensively about Timothy Ashford, describing him as a strange boy who speaks to shadows and carries death in his pockets, and revealed that her father had become increasingly disturbed by Timothy's accurate predictions about where more bodies would be found on the academy grounds. According to Margaret's diary, the situation reached its climax during the school's annual spring festival, when Timothy publicly announced to the assembled families that "the old teacher walks these halls still, and he shows me where the children sleep forever." This declaration, made in front of Millbrook's most prominent citizens, triggered the investigation that ultimately uncovered Edmund Crow's crimes and led to the academy's hasty closure. Margaret's final entries describe the frantic efforts to destroy all evidence of the school's existence, including the systematic burning of records and photographs, making the survival of the class portrait all the more remarkable and mysterious. Perhaps the most significant discovery Marcus made was Margaret's description of Timothy's final day at the academy, when he was seen carefully placing the photograph in a metal box, along with several of his collected bones, and burying the container beneath the school's front steps. Her diary entry read, "Timothy said the photograph must survive so that someday, when the time is right, someone will remember the forgotten children and give them the peace they deserve." This revelation transformed Marcus's understanding of the photograph from a mere historical curiosity into what amounted to a time capsule deliberately preserved by a child who possessed an otherworldly understanding of justice and remembrance. As Marcus sat in his apartment that night, surrounded by copies of documents and photographs that painted a picture of systematic cover-up and supernatural intervention, he realized that Timothy Ashford hadn't simply been a disturbed child. He had been a vessel for the voices of murdered innocents, and the photograph was his gift to the future. The weight of this knowledge settled heavily on Marcus's shoulders as he stared at the boy's intense eyes in the sepia-toned image, and he whispered into the darkness, "I understand now, Timothy. You've been waiting over a century for someone to listen." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Marcus contacted Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic archaeologist from Yale University, who specialized in historical crime scenes and had the authority to properly investigate the Crescent Hill Estate's development. After reviewing Marcus's extensive research and Margaret Whitmore's diary entries, Dr. Chen agreed to conduct a preliminary ground-penetrating radar survey of the area where the Academy had once stood. The results were both heartbreaking and vindicating. The radar revealed multiple anomalous signatures consistent with unmarked graves scattered throughout the development, confirming that Crow's victims had never been properly recovered or given decent burials. Working with local law enforcement and the State Archaeological Commission, Dr. Chen's team began a careful excavation of the most promising sites, treating each discovery with the reverence and scientific rigor that the victims had been denied in their deaths. Within 3 days, they had uncovered the remains of 5 children, all showing signs of trauma consistent with violent deaths, and all buried in the hasty, shallow graves that Timothy Ashford had somehow been able to locate through means that defied conventional explanation. Each set of remains was accompanied by personal effects, brass buttons, fragments of clothing, and small toys that helped establish their identities through comparison with missing persons records from the 1870s and 1880s. The most significant discovery came when the team excavated the exact location where the Academy's front steps had once stood, following Margaret Whitmore's diary description of Timothy's burial site. Buried 3 feet beneath the surface, they found a corroded metal box containing not only bones that matched those visible in the photograph, but also a collection of small personal items that had belonged to Crow's victims: a rag doll, a wooden whistle, a child's silver locket. Most remarkably, the box also contained a handwritten note in Timothy's careful script that read, "These children had names and families and dreams. Edmund Crow took everything from them, but their spirits guided my hands to find them. May this photograph serve as witness to their truth when the time of remembering comes." The investigation that followed Timothy's posthumous revelation exposed the full scope of the historical cover-up and led to a complete re-examination of Millbrook's 19th century records. Genealogical research revealed that several prominent local families had been aware of Crow's crimes, but had chosen silence over justice to protect their social standing and financial interests. The Whitmore family, in particular, had used their considerable wealth and influence to orchestrate the systematic destruction of evidence and the intimidation of potential witnesses, creating a conspiracy of silence that had endured for over a century. As news of the discovery spread, descendants of both victims and conspirators came forward with family stories and documents that had been hidden for generations. The revelation sparked a community-wide reckoning with Millbrook's sanitized version of its own history, and led to the establishment of a memorial garden on the site where the Academy had once stood. Each of Crow's identified victims received a proper burial, with their names engraved in stone, while Timothy Ashford was honored with a special monument recognizing his role as their unlikely champion and voice from beyond the grave. Marcus's role in uncovering the truth transformed him from a quiet town archivist into a nationally recognized expert on historical cold cases, and the power of photographic evidence to preserve truth across generations. The mysterious photograph that had started his journey was donated to the Smithsonian Institution, where it became the centerpiece of an exhibition on hidden histories and forgotten voices that toured the country, educating thousands about the importance of confronting uncomfortable truths from the past. But for Marcus, the greatest satisfaction came from knowing that Timothy Ashford's century-long vigil had finally ended. And as he stood at the boy's newly dedicated memorial, he spoke softly to the carved stone inscription, "Your mission is complete, Timothy. They will never be forgotten again." 6 months after the Whitmore Academy revelations rocked the quiet town of Millbrook, Marcus Henley found himself fundamentally changed by his encounter with Timothy Ashford's supernatural persistence and the weight of historical truth. The media attention surrounding the case had brought both acclaim and scrutiny to his work, but more importantly, it had awakened in him a deeper understanding of his responsibility as a keeper of historical records. Marcus had been approached by families across New England, seeking help in uncovering their own buried family secrets and lost histories, transforming his role from passive archivist to active investigator of historical injustices that had been deliberately concealed. The town of Millbrook itself underwent a profound transformation as residents grappled with the reality that their community's pristine reputation had been built on a foundation of silence and complicity. The Crescent Hill Estates development, once the most prestigious address in town, became a site of pilgrimage for those seeking to honor the memory of Crow's victims and reflect on the consequences of choosing comfort over truth. Several longtime residents revealed that they had heard whispered stories about the academy throughout their lives, but had dismissed them as local folklore. Now understanding that folklore often preserves truths that official histories choose to forget, the psychological impact on Marcus was perhaps the most profound change of all, as he struggled to process the supernatural elements of Timothy's story while maintaining his scientific skepticism as a trained historian. The boy's apparent ability to communicate with the dead and predict the location of hidden graves challenged Marcus's understanding of reality in ways that no amount of academic training had prepared him to handle. He began collaborating with parapsychologists and researchers who specialized in unexplained phenomena, contributing to a growing body of literature that explored the intersection between historical trauma and paranormal activity. Dr. Sarah Chen's archaeological work at the site continued for several more months, ultimately recovering the remains of 9 children and uncovering evidence that Crow's crimes had extended back nearly 2 decades before Timothy's arrival at the academy. The forensic evidence painted a picture of systematic abuse and murder that had been enabled by the isolation of the school and the vulnerability of its orphan students. Each new discovery reinforced the magnitude of Timothy's achievement in exposing these crimes through means that conventional investigation had never been able to accomplish. The legal ramifications of the case extended far beyond historical curiosity, as descendants of Crow's victims filed lawsuits against the estates of families who had participated in the cover-up, seeking both monetary damages and formal acknowledgement of their ancestors' suffering. The case established important legal precedents regarding historical crimes and the responsibility of communities to confront past injustices, influencing similar cases across the country where marginalized populations had been victimized and then erased from official records. Marcus established the Timothy Ashford Foundation for Historical Truth, dedicated to investigating cases where vulnerable populations had been victimized and their stories deliberately suppressed from historical records. The Foundation's work expanded to include collaboration with indigenous communities, immigrant families, and other marginalized groups whose experiences had been systematically excluded from mainstream historical narratives. The mysterious photograph that had started Marcus's journey became the foundation symbol, representing the power of preserved evidence to speak truth across generations when living voices had been silenced. As Marcus reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought him into contact with Timothy Ashford's century-old mission, he understood that the boy's story was ultimately about the persistence of truth and the moral obligation of each generation to confront the uncomfortable realities of the past. The photograph had waited in darkness for over 100 years, but when the time was right, it had found its way to someone who would listen to its silent testimony and act upon its revelations. Standing once again in the memorial garden where the Whitmore Academy had once stood, Marcus looked at Timothy's monument and felt a profound sense of completion, knowing that some mysteries are meant to be solved not for the sake of curiosity, but for the sacred duty of giving voice to the voiceless. In the gentle evening breeze, Marcus could almost hear the whispered gratitude of children who had finally found peace, and he smiled as he realized the truth always finds a way to surface, no matter how deeply it's buried or how long it takes.